So, taking a look into the elections to an even deeper level, we're joined by Matthew Ehret. He wrote a book or an article talking about the bankers' coup in 1934, where they were almost overthrown by a bunch of basically a bunch of the wealthy elite. And he posted it again in July, just after the assassination attempt on Trump, called "Why Assume There Will Be a 2024 Election? America's 1934 Bankers Coup Plot Revisited." Well, Matthew Ehret, he is the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review, senior fellow at the American University in Moscow, and director of the Rising Tide Foundation. He's authored 3 volumes of the Untold History of Canada book series and 4 volumes of the Clash of the Two Americans, and he hosts Connecting the Dots on TNT Radio, Breaking History on Badlands Media, and The Great Game on Rogue News. Welcome to the Global Research News Hour, Matt.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, unfortunately, the TNT show no longer exists, but everything else you just said still holds up. So I'm very happy to be with you.
Okay, so Matthew, what was it? I mean, when you wrote that article and then you reposted it, it suggests that there are some things happening in the world currently that there's some commonality with the years immediately after the 1929 crash. Do you want to elaborate on those similarities?
Yeah, sure. And this was actually turned into a documentary that my wife, myself, and our filmmaker friend Jason put together as well, which people can watch on our website, CanadianPatriot.org. But indeed, it's an important lesson, I think, to look at the world prior to the Great Depression in order to get some insight into the orchestration of the controlled disintegration of the transatlantic banking system, which has been put into motion really over the past 50 years today, as well as the solutions being offered by those very same arsonists who lit the fire, which, if you look at the case of 1929, many of those, the transformation of the US economy into a easy money speculative bubble, which is what happened under the period of Coolidge. And really, it had been sliding that way since Teddy Roosevelt, resulted in a bubble that was highly overvalued. The broker call loans were represented 5 times more than the value of the entire stock markets. People were gambling with savings and commercial banking that was being put into speculation. So that resulted in a insane amount of bubbles built upon bubbles, which were induced to pop as we go through in the documentary and the essay that you've referenced, resulting in a calling in on a coordinated single day of the broker call loans, which orchestrated the Great Depression. And for those who were in the know, and by that I refer to the JP Morgan preferred clients list, very high level people within Wall Street, within Washington, were able to sell their stocks short and conduct probably the biggest wealth transfer in history that also coincided with these same institutions funding fascism. Henry Luce was just of Time magazine was just one of a big part of a broad establishment that was trying to say, okay, if you want to put food on your plates again, if you want to feed your kids, then fascism is the economic miracle solution. Look how good it's working in Germany and in Italy, and in what soon became Spain. And fortunately for the world, the only non-fascist sort of oriented representative, Franklin Roosevelt, was able to succeed in winning the Democratic primaries in 1932. And he began a war on those very same fascists. And when he began to utilize the powers of the Constitution to defend the people and to rein in the banks through things like Glass-Steagall, the breaking up of the banks, bringing hundreds of bankers to jail, into courts first, then jail, the Pecora commissions. He did a whole wide array of things, both in America, but also against the City of London. He pulled out the U.S. delegation from the League of Nations, Bank of England, London Conference, which was itself a major conference that was supposed to usher in a one world government under a League of Nations where no more sovereignty would be permitted to participating nations. And he pulled out the U.S. Delegates in June of 1933. So he was declaring a full-out war against this global pro-fascist banking parasite that was trying to get a new world order back in those days.
And it seems like we really underestimate how the United States stood against this move worldwide towards fascism.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been overlooked because a lot of our history books over the last 60, 70 years, especially since the murder of JFK, who I think was the last real self-conscious representative of that better tradition, was murdered. Those history books were written by those very fascists that tried to kill Roosevelt twice, that tried to run
Mm.
the bankers' coup, which Smedley Butler, a leading general, exposed and filmed himself going through how these various DuPont, Rockefeller, JP Morgan bankers were trying to use him as a battering ram to install a fascist military dictator in America, in order to bring the U.S. ultimately into an alliance with Nazi Germany. And so he blew the whistle. He stopped it from happening. And we're this should be common knowledge for every child before they get into grade 2, whether you're in Canada or the United States. And today, unfortunately, most adults don't even know that this happened.
Yeah. Even in Quebec, there was a movement towards fascism, right?
Yeah, the Adrian Arcand, the blue shirts, as they called them, which was very
Uh-huh.
powerful. Actually, Adrian Arcand, the Quebec Nazi, was the Quebec lieutenant of R.B. Bennett, the prime minister, the conservative prime minister between 19, I think, 30 and 34, who bankrolled Adrian Arcand's newspapers. He managed, yeah. So I mean, and R.B. Bennett was somebody who was a great he retired in London. He really wasn't a Canadian in his soul, and was part of this broader roundtable Milner Cecil Rhodes conspiracy to bring about a one world British Empire, and a recapturing of the US as an instrument of said empire to subdue and enslave colonial nations.
Yeah. So what's happening right now? And like, but there's in this case there is no Roosevelt and no um, Smedley Butler to
No.
get in the way this time.
Well, there's a weak echo of what I think FDR, what made him potent, in opposition to this global technocratic parasite of transhumanist, or it wasn't called transhumanist in the 30s. That name came later, but then it was still called eugenics. The idea of, a certain elite cadre of alphas shaping the levers of human evolution in some pseudo Darwinian, struggle of the strongest against the weakest. So that was a very big thing as a pseudoscience that was shaping the structures of global control across America, Canada. I mean, it was being taught in McGill, Harvard, Yale, Oxford. We were passing sterilization laws for the unfit. So that it got rebranded into transhumanism and a few other things after World War II. But today, I would say, Donald Trump is a shadow, an echo, an authentic disruptive echo
Mm.
of what FDR represented as an instinct towards trying to, um, not get enmeshed in foreign adventures and forever wars, which we saw in his first term in office, and his commitment, I think, generally to try to force some sort of a reconciliation on the Ukraine front, at the very least, does represent, I think, an important aspect of a conversation that has to happen, as well as what he's tried to do with his Agenda 47 package, which
Mm.
is which is calling for restoring protectionism. He's directly citing Lincoln and McKinley as the true representatives of what the Republican Party once was and should become again, which I think is very important. And that emphasis on rebuilding manufacturing through protective tariffs, which I think that's if the West is going to survive, it has to be through a rediscovery that was how we built ourselves to make ourselves not suck
Yeah.
before you and I were even born. That was what was a big part of not sucking and
Yeah.
becoming like a viable country that could then look to others from different cultures as participating partners in a broader mission in life, and we've lost that
Mm.
over like 50 years of empire and neocon Straussian insanity. So I'm thinking that for all of his problems, and there are many, and a lot
Oh
of
yeah.
vipers and Trojan horses all around him who I don't trust, he does still represent that disruptive factor that is intolerable to that same institution that tried to kill Roosevelt, that tried to push fascism as their solution.
Yeah. There were
So yeah,
assassination
that's.
attempts against Roosevelt, and there are going to be, or there have been at least two attempts against Trump so far, right?
I mean, there's fishy business around them. I mean, there's questions that I would like still pose, but definitely,
Mhm.
there's attempts at the very least, um, to I mean, the fact that JD Vance was selected on the same day that the that first attempt was made on Trump, which again is a very weird story on so many levels. But I think a direct message, however that occurred, I think that was a direct message for Trump as a bit of a threat to take on Vance, who I don't trust, and I think he is a more of an asset of Peter Thiel and the whole Palantir military industrial transhumanist component of the establishment, which hired Vance when he was just out of Yale, and he's been a part of it ever since. It's been bankrolling his rise to fame. So I do think that they're trying to flood Trump's entourage with more controlled assets that could be used to rebrand the American First movement or the MAGA movement into a pro-imperial movement against the will of many of those who are otherwise rallying around that banner. That's a concern I have.
Yeah. Well, do you think that they might find an excuse for postponing the election, or if not canceling altogether, due to things like the new pandemic, World War III, cyber attacks, global depression, or anything else?
Well, those are all concerns I have too. You know, there's a lot of different choices they have to play with, whether we see the cyber polygon operations, all sorts of things that could feasibly kick over the chessboard and result in the sort of effect that we saw in Ukraine, where Zelensky's mandate technically ended legally in like May of this year, but he's still there because it's an emergency. So who knows? There could be something like that. There could be a variety of other things that could cause an election cycle to be canceled for national security purposes. But the mind can't ignore those things. I think that, and that's why I've been writing what I've been writing and putting forth those documentaries, to get people to focus on who might like to otherwise kick over the chessboard.
Okay, so just as we get close, because it's about a little over 3 weeks away from the election. I mean, are we likely going to see something happen before the election, or is it more likely that there will be an election and then these wizards are going to work their magic to the
I've got scenarios.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got scenarios. I mean, one scenario that I think is a consideration. I mean, it's a consideration I'm not optimistic about, but is that they might get their Teddy Roosevelt moment in with Vance, because the way Teddy Roosevelt, who was he's the one who ushered in 1902 in a big way the Anglo-American special relationship in the first way, and turned the U.S. he did the most to turn the U.S. into an imperial force, which was historically against America's traditions. So that's his big stick diplomacy, the abuse of the Monroe Doctrine. But the way they got him in was they killed McKinley. So they got McKinley's vice president to die very conveniently in 1899. Garth, I forgot his last name, and then they got in Teddy Roosevelt, who was a bit of an insignificant cowboy-like figure who idolized British imperialism. And then as soon as the people who loved McKinley voted for McKinley, they killed McKinley. And then all of a sudden you have a convenient Wall Street stooge in the form of Teddy, who brings in a totally different foreign policy paradigm into America, which did a lot of damage. He brought in eugenics, so many things. And it took 3 decades for a healing process to even begin in that case. And it took his distant cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, to start turning the U.S. back towards its true foundations. So today, they could possibly get an election, which involves Trump becoming president and then eliminating Trump to get in President Vance. They could otherwise do a variety of things before that, as far as unleashing a war. I mean, if there's several spark plugs that could result in a war conflict moving beyond the limits of the Middle East. That could also involve canceling elections. You've got potential pandemics that we've seen them setting the stage for on the propaganda level that they might want to release, or maybe just another false flag, right? And blame Russia or blame China or blame Iran or some combination, in order to then say, okay, well, we're now in enabling acts, continuity of government mode, which is what we saw with Hitler burning down his own Reichstag in 1933 through the SS, doing it to themselves, and then saying, okay, now we're going to get rid of the Weimar Republic and install a momentary dictatorship to restore order, but that was never going to end. So that could be another scenario that could be floated, So people have to be very on guard. On top of, I didn't even talk about the economic meltdown, which we're ripe. I mean, this system is ripe for an economic blowout.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a bunch of spark plugs that could usher in a chain reaction. It's probably the most dangerous period to have been to be alive in, I would say, at this moment.
Yeah, ominous warning. Matt, I got to go, but I really want to thank you for joining us, and I look forward. We'll have you back maybe next month or something like that.
Anytime. All right,
Okay.
take care.
Matt Eric is the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review and Montreal-based analyst. He spoke to us from Montreal. Coming up next week, we will be looking at a program exploring academics, journalists, and activists who have been suppressed for stating and expressing dissident views. You've been listening to the Global Research News Hour. You can listen to our programs every week on CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and on partnering radio stations across Canada and the United States. You can also download each episode from the website globalresearch.ca. To leave feedback on this program, email globalresearchnewshour@gmail.com. I'm series host, creator, and producer Michael Welch. Join us again next week.